Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining the session on multilateral trade negotiations and trade and services. Can everyone hear me okay? I'll take that as yes. So my name is
Yes.
Barbe, and I'm a consultant at the World Bank. Alla Golub from the Center for Global Trade Analysis is hosting and recording today's sessions, and will help ensure we try to keep roughly to our allotted time. Before we get to the presentations, let me remind everyone of the following session protocols and etiquette so that the session runs smoothly. They're basically just like three things you need to know. Actually, four things. So first, all attendees except the person currently speaking should remain muted. Unless otherwise noted, presentations will last 20 minutes. Alla will verbally prompt the presenter when there are 2 minutes remaining in their allotted time. And when time ends, if the presentation hasn't already ended, Alla will prompt again, and I'll move us on to the discussion period. So after those 20 minutes of presentation, we'll have 10 minutes of discussions immediately following each presentation. Our kind of like protocol is for questions or comments to be entered into chat. It's kind of like the preference, but you can raise your virtual hands as well. I'll monitor the chat and participant list for raised hands during the discussion period, read chat entries for the presenter to verbally respond to, and call upon people who raise hands. So this will continue until Alla prompts that there's only 2 minutes remaining for the discussion time. At that point, we'll wrap up and begin to move on to the next session. Following all but the final presentation, there'll be a 2-minute transition period to allow the next presenter to load, share their presentation. During that time, I'll present the next speaker. So during the session, we're going to hear from 4 different people. And so without further ado, allow me to introduce our first speaker, Maros Ivanic from USDA's ERS, presenting on how bilateral trade deals get in the way of multilateral trade agreements. Maros, the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, Andre. Can you hear me okay? If you can, I'll switch to the presentation. My apologies, we usually use Teams, so I'm not terribly familiar with this, so just give me 1 second. And hopefully now you can see the presentation. I cannot see anybody, so I assume the answer is that yes. Okay, you can see it. Okay, wonderful. So, so thank you for the introduction. So a little bit about the motivation for this work and how did this start? What is it that we were trying to achieve here? Was that as I mentioned, I work at the ERS, specifically market and economic trade, market and trade division. So we actually care a lot about trade, and even though there's no any particular reason, no specific negotiations or anything happening too much visibly in this space, we have been always concerned about how the international trade could be improved in order to provide for more free trade, and what are the conditions and constraints that might get in a way of getting us to the more free trade globally. This is joint work with Jason Beckman and Salim Sheikh. So it was the 3 of us working on that for about almost a year now. So a little bit about the context, or the main question actually that we are asking here is, can countries unilaterally negotiate better trade deals than multilateral agreements? And I think this is a question that has been on a lot of people's minds. I don't think that I'm the first one, or we're the first ones to ask. Actually, if you remember, if you're older, just like I am, historically there have been a lot of attempts to liberalize global trade through global agreements. So you may remember GATT, you may remember the attempts by the World Trade Organization. The last big attempt, which was the Doha round, which unfortunately failed. And if you may have attended the GTAP conference maybe 20 years ago or 15 years ago, actually a lot of sessions will be devoted to the Doha round. And of course, after its failure, a lot of people were asking, what does it mean? Countries, of course, started moving towards more regional or bilateral agreements once the global agreements seemed to be unreachable. And at that time, a lot of people sounded alarm. Is this a good thing? Is the move of countries such as the European Union doing its diagonal agreements at that time with the North African countries and Middle East countries, or the United States doing a lot of bilateral agreements, is this actually helping us to reach the global state where trade would be freer, or is this effort actually something that prevents getting a better multilateral agreement? So that was the question that was asked in the early 2000s, and I don't think that was answered to actually my satisfaction or satisfaction of a lot of people, in my opinion. So this is the question: can these negotiations or these regional and bilateral agreements get us where we need to be, where we want to be in a world of free trade, or is it something that is in our way? Now, of course, a lot of people have done a lot of work on this already. This is not, again, us thinking of this idea of this question as the first people. So there's a lot of theoretical work that has been done. So again, 2007, they considered what are the conditions that might allow countries to reach through negotiations global free trade, and they come up with these highly stylized scenarios. But depending on how the individual commodities and individual countries are behaving in terms of when they are added to a coalition of free trade or countries which trade freely, whether this is improving welfare or it might actually be working the opposite direction. Based on that, you might actually end up with the idea that countries negotiate by themselves create something called stumbling blocks, which prevent further trade integration, or they could be working positively as a building block towards increasing the size of the countries, the bloc, the coalition, trading freely. But it all depends on the concept of super additivity, which means what happens if two countries join together in a coalition of free trade? Is this actually welfare improving, or is this actually working the opposite direction? So depending on that, whether the super additivity holds, which means that adding more countries to the coalition is improving things, or whether it doesn't hold, which means adding more countries actually might work the opposite direction. Depending on that, you may get a different answer. So we actually don't really get an answer out of this work. Now, SAGI 2010, they also looked at the possibilities of reaching global free trade. And what they conclude is that, well, the answer, whether this is actually something that may happen, depends. It depends on the countries' asymmetries in their endowments specifically. And so depending on what is the underlying structure of the countries, their endowments, you actually may not reach a multilateral free trade agreement. But they concluded bilateral agreements actually could lead to free trade. So looking at that and not really being able to get an answer, we realize that this is essentially an empirical question. The answer most likely will depend on the details of the existing protection, the existing taxation, countries' endowments and preferences, and based on what is the underlying state of the country's preferences and endowments, the answer actually might be one or the other, which means that perhaps allowing the countries to negotiate bilaterally could lead us towards a freer trade or not. And of course, we were thinking that the GTAP framework is an excellent way for us to look into this issue, because of course GTAP has a very rich database of the trade flows, endowments, protection, all of that is in there, which means that as long as we are able to formulate our problem, run it through the GTAP framework, through the GTAP model, we should be able to get our answer. However, we also are painfully aware that there's a lot of commodities, a lot of countries in the world, and trying to look at all the combinations of the trade agreements might actually not be feasible given the computational limits of our computers and even in today's world. So we decided that to keep things simple, we're just going to look at just the TPP group of the countries, which is the Trans-Pacific Partnership countries, just the 12 countries that originally were thinking about creating the TPP. Of course, that it was later replaced by TCTPP, but nonetheless, we were concerned about this particular group. And we also restricted ourselves just to 10 commodities, heavily focused on agriculture, of course, because this is where most of the protection lies. And I will show you the aggregation just in a moment. and the idea that we were trying to, that we wanted to work through was, first, let's just consider the envisioned multilateral agreement. So let's just imagine that the TPP would go ahead, and we calculated the welfare gains from that agreement. And then as an alternative, we would allow the countries to negotiate their own bilateral agreements, which means that any country from this group of 12 countries could approach another country with a proposal to sign a bilateral agreement. Now, how the countries agree or whether or not they would sign a bilateral agreement? Well, we decided that in an attempt to be realistic, that the countries would agree on a deal which must maximize the proposing country's own welfare, which means that a country that approaches another country is doing its calculation, runs its own GTAP model, and finds that this agreement would maximize our welfare. However, if that agreement would be hurting the partner country, there's no chance that that country would accept that deal, of course. So we assumed that any deal which would not make the partner country worse off would be accepted. And then we allowed the countries to negotiate in the same sequence, which means that country A talks to country B, then talks to country C, etc. And they all take turns until we come to the point when no country wants to make any more changes, which means that we have reached a national equilibrium. Of course, when you hear this, that countries negotiate in a specific order, there's a good chance that the order of negotiations may matter. And actually it does. And so we considered several random orders of negotiation. So we just reshuffle the countries and allow them to go in a different order to proceed with this bilateral negotiations. Now, the aggregation was very simple. As I mentioned, we really knew that we were going into something that was heavily computationally heavy. So we only have the red countries and TPP countries, and then the rest of the world is really just China, EU, and the rest of the world, just to keep things simple, so that we actually were able to get the results in a reasonable amount of time. Now, the illustration of the bargaining game that we are modeling, and I went through this already, but I just wanted to highlight here the computational difficulties of what we were trying to do. So let me just go through this bargaining game in more detail. So for each of our bilateral scenarios, we would first randomize the country order. So here you're looking at one of the examples of our random country order. So here's Vietnam first, Peru second, and New Zealand last. Of course, in the next simulation, it could be the opposite. So in this case, the negotiations start with Vietnam negotiating with Peru. Vietnam would look at all these 10 commodities and would consider all permutations, which is actually a lot, 1,024 permutations of all of commodities to be either included or excluded from the agreement with Peru. Then once the Vietnam identifies which of those agreements is maximizing their welfare, they would actually first exclude all the agreements which make Peru worse off. So they find the one which maximizes their welfare without making Peru worse off. And then we assume that this would be adopted. And then Vietnam moves to the negotiations with the second country. So now it would go to Australia. And then after all the countries take turns, of course, the last country which will be negotiating this time will be New Zealand with Malaysia. Now, it's important to notice that we update the agreements each time, which means that once Vietnam concluded its negotiations with Peru, all of that is incorporated in the tax structure, the tariff structure of the model, which means that the next negotiation takes that position, that existing state of tariffs as its starting point. And we keep doing this until no country wants to make any further changes, as I mentioned, which means that we are at the Nash equilibrium. Now, to make things even more simple for us was that we did not allow countries to find their welfare maximizing tariff rates. That would be actually quite difficult, I think. I'm not saying impossible, but probably much more difficult than we were able to deal with at this time. So what we did was we considered the final tariffs negotiated under the TPP as the tariffs which would be the preferential tariffs offered to all partners if a bilateral agreement is reached, which means that for many countries, like such as Australia, Brunei, New Zealand, Mexico, and others, if a commodity was included in the bilateral deal, then the tariff would go to zero, but not in all cases. So in Japan, as you know, the protection on rice is high. So the concession or the offered rate that Japan negotiated under the TPP would be still 243% tariff on rice. And in the case of dairy in Canada, there's also a substantial protection which would remain in place, which means we're not really going all the way to zero. We're just lowering the tariffs to the TPP, to the agreed level under the TPP negotiations. A little bit on the technical implementation. We use still this classic GTAP model, and of course, whoever attended the previous sessions, there was a very persuasive argument to move to version 7, and I promised that this is something that we will start thinking about. It looks like this is definitely an improvement. Unfortunately for this work, we still stuck to the classic version of the model. We use the GTAP database version 11 with those 15 countries that I mentioned and 10 commodities. And we reduce tariffs to the agreed levels from the table that I just presented just by changing the TMS variable, which of course means that this is a very simple simulation. What is not simple, of course, is that there's a lot of simulations you have to run because as I mentioned, if Vietnam is negotiating with Peru, it has to actually have the results of over 1,000 simulations. So that's actually what took a lot of time. It would be very difficult to do this by hand. So we did all of that. We ran these negotiation games in R. So we scripted this. R would randomize the country's orders, would run the simulations, would evaluate each country's options, would find the agreement that would be agreed on, would update the agreements, and that keep running until nobody wants to make any more changes, which means that we've reached the equilibrium. And of course, if somebody wants to know, this actually took like 3 days per each simulation, so for each randomized order. So it wasn't actually terribly fast. I was hoping to have actually more of these simulations, but I was just unable to find a fast enough computer to get us to that point. But fortunately, we were able to run 10 of the bilateral scenarios. A little bit on the scenarios. The closure is just the standard long run. Standard GTAP parameters, we didn't really change anything. As I mentioned, we ran the multilateral scenario, which is just a TPP agreement. This was just to see how well these bilateral scenarios would do in terms of welfare. And these bilateral scenarios, there were 10 of them. As I mentioned, we each time randomized the order, and then we ran it until we reached the Nash equilibrium. And as I said, it took about 3 days to run each one of those. So let's look at some of the results. So on the right side, you see the multilateral one. So the multilateral one is something that we would normally think is the welfare maximizing. And actually, this is something that we tested later, and I will present a little bit more on that in just a moment. So under the multilateral agreement, as you can see, the total, let me see if I can get my laser pointer. So the total gain is about $27 billion to the 12 TPP countries. And as you can see, we did the full decomposition of welfare, and this is just fairly standard result where we see that a lot of allocated efficiency in terms of trade efficiencies, they all sum up to this number. Now let's look at the bilateral result, and this is what we were interested in. We were interested in knowing whether this allowing these countries to be negotiating for themselves without having the body that would be negotiating for everybody or reaching the multilateral agreement, whether this actually can get us to the same welfare gains as the multilateral agreement. As you can see that the gain is actually a little bit smaller. It's $24.5 billion, so which means it's smaller. That's actually what we expected. We thought that there probably would be some stumbling blocks along the way, and the countries might not actually reach the full potential of a multilateral agreement. But the question, of course, is this number the best that they can do, or is it actually something that could be a worse number depending on the order of negotiation? So we'll get to that in a moment. But one more point that I wanted to make was that the bargaining game that I described may give the impression that countries only do what they want to do, what is welfare maximizing to them. And you might be surprised to see that even under the bilateral agreements, some of the countries experience welfare losses. For example, the United States, Malaysia, and Brunei. The question is, why would these countries get into this position if they had the choice to reject or not to accept any agreement which would make them worse off? How did this happen? Well, in reality, what happens is that countries are not immune to what other countries are doing. So actually, as you can see, all of those countries experience terms of trade deterioration because the other countries are doing things. They are able to and to negotiate their own bilateral agreements. So actually, when you look at the overall numbers from the bilateral and multilateral agreements, they're actually not very different. You may end up losing under both of these scenarios. So the second question is, we looked at one particular order of countries negotiating. Is this the best that they can do? Or can they do better? Or can they actually do worse? So we ran this 10 times just to see what would be the distribution of these gains. As you can see, the red line here in this chart shows you where the multilateral agreement is, and this is about $27 billion. When we ran this more times, as you can see, sometimes we actually got closer, sometimes we got a little bit further away from the optimum. So the lowest welfare gain we measured was $24 billion, and the highest was very close to the multilateral agreement, $27.2 billion. So what it means is that depending on the order of the countries, you actually make it very close or not that close. But even if you're not terribly close, the loss is about 10%. So you actually would be able to get 90% of the benefits of the multilateral agreement by allowing the countries to negotiate for themselves, which actually might mean that it's maybe a good thing, or if you're aiming for the perfect, then probably you will not get there. Now, another question which came up in our analysis afterwards was, and we realized we already had the framework to answer that question, is actually something that people usually do not think too much about, and the question is the multilateral agreement actually the best possible? Since we already had all the machinery in place and we were able to run this easily in R, we actually were able to run 660 simulations, so to exclude each one product from each bilateral agreement, just to see whether countries actually would have any incentive to move away from the multilateral agreement if they had the choice. So we tried to exclude each commodity alone from each country pair. In 80%,
Maros, 2 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. In 80 cases, the exclusion increased the welfare, but it was usually the gains which were the gains went to the third country. In 72 cases, so the benefits would go somewhere else. But in 8 cases, excluding a commodity from a bilateral agreement would actually benefit the trading partners, which means that the idea of the super additivity, which means that adding more countries and more commodities, more coverage to the multilateral agreement might occasionally be violated at a very granular level. And this is something that actually was new to me. I didn't really think that this actually would happen, but actually it happens in a very rare instances. Now, a lot of people, including myself, we think, well, super additivity should be still holding at some level, at a higher level, because this is how we usually think about free trade, which means adding more countries to the trade agreement should be good, should be better. Adding more coverage should be better. So we tested that as well, which means that we did it by excluding just one commodity at a time from the whole agreement and one country at a time from the whole agreement. And we found that the super additivity actually does hold, which means that the conventional thinking that adding more is better actually works in general, but there could be some minor exemptions when we get to the very detailed level. So just to conclude, since I'm running out of time, we were able to show that using the GTAP database and its model, of course, as a representation of the world, that it's actually not very likely that the TPP countries would be able to reach the benefits of the multilateral agreement by just negotiating by themselves. But they would get very close. So we often see these stumbling blocks happening, and which means that the countries get locked in a position where no further integration is possible. But the important thing is also that multilateral agreement is not welfare maximizing and can be further improved, even though there are a few, usually only a few commodities, which makes sense to exclude from those agreements. So what this tells us is that we appear to be running into the limits of superadditivity. So even though we're generally thinking that expanding the coverage of free trade is a good thing, this actually does not hold once we get to very detailed commodity country pairs. Of course, there's some interesting future research that comes out of this that we are thinking of, and that is, and we haven't answered that at all, is can we actually understand what are the characteristics of countries which lead towards these building blocks, and which characteristics lead towards the stumbling blocks? So is there any particular characteristic of a country that should tell us that, well, that country should be leading the negotiations so that they actually can get to the closer to the maximum welfare benefits, or are there countries which actually should probably be the last ones to negotiate? So that's something that we also are thinking about, and I'm interested to hear from the audience if there's any ideas, any thoughts. Thank you very much for listening.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Maros. Now let's go ahead and take some questions from the audience. As a reminder, please, you can either enter questions in chat or raise your virtual hand to be called upon. So let's start it off with David.
Hi, Maros. Hopefully you guys can hear me all right. Really interesting presentation and good work as always. Yeah, I had two questions, if I could sum up my thoughts. So first of all, so when you showed that those different sequences and you showed that kind of one of them was kind of close to the multilateral level, do you have any idea how close that is to like an optimal sequence, or did you try and look at like a kind of optimal sequence? Because I know you said those were kind of randomly distributed. And then, yeah, secondly as well, do you think, I guess somewhat related to your question of like a leading country, but do you think for like an individual country, say, I don't know, the US or, you know, whoever, is there like an optimal sequence for them with signing each of those countries, and what, like, how different would that, do you think that would look compared to, I guess, the overall welfare level when you have this like multilateral agreement? Thank you.
These are excellent questions. I must admit that we were much more optimistic that we would be able to get deeper towards answering those questions. So regarding the first question about identifying the optimal sort of sequence of the countries, what we were hoping to do was run many more of these random simulations, random orderings, and then try to see statistically to identify what are the attributes of the countries which might lead towards to better outcomes. Unfortunately, with only 10 observations, this is very hard to do. I know this is a lazy approach, of course, but I think statistics sometimes can reveal easily what is important, what is not. So if we were able to run maybe 100 times, maybe some patterns would come out, and we would be able to say that maybe countries which are more trading more, maybe the trade is a larger share of their GDP, perhaps they should be going first or maybe last. I do not know, but that's where our thoughts were. If I'm able to get my hands on a better computer, and that actually might happen, I might be able to proceed with this, and then we would be able to answer this question about the optimal sequence. And then your second question does follow directly from that, and the description of what does it mean to the countries that are starting the negotiations. If I understood, what does it mean for those countries? Is there perhaps any benefit by going first? That would be, of course, something that we would be looking into. But I feel that we need to get just more of those random simulations in, so that we can start looking at these relationships, which might not be obvious to us until we are able to run it through some statistics.
Thanks. If I can ask a follow-up, if possible as well. So You're showing like how you kept kind of the commodity individual like tariff agreements to kind of the fixed levels that you see from the agreement. So to what extent as well, and I feel like it'd be really, really messy, but to what extent do you think if those bilateral agreements then sort of welfare maximize based on the commodities, to what extent do you think that might change things? It would end up being, I think, like a bit of a mess, but yeah.
If we allow these tariffs to be determined endogenously?
Yeah, so for example, like rather than, yeah, basically, yeah, but in the bilateral agreements themselves.
Yeah. Well, I would love to do that, and that would be messy. It would like take a lot of time because what we were doing, we would have to do would be optimize. Probably we would have to optimize still GTAP in Genpack and moving it into some optimization software, R perhaps. That probably would take a lot of time. I would love to do that, of course, because this could give us some additional insights, would make this story more interesting. We would be able to see what these countries might actually offer in these bilateral deals. And you're right, it probably would be a different deal from the one that they offered at the multilateral stage. We assumed that the rates that they would offer to their partners individually would be those that they agreed to when they were negotiating TPP, and it's possible that they might be actually willing to go to lower rates if they speak to specific partners. So yeah, that's a very good point. I agree that this would be hard to do. I'm hoping that at some point we would be able to do that. Some of you might know that I'm also trying to move GTAP into something like Julia or R, so we'll be able to run these optimizations very quickly. But yeah, there's still some time away from us. But it's a great thought, much appreciated.
All right,
Thank you.
Taojun. Oh, never mind. Well, I guess unless there are any other questions, Alla, do you think we should move to the next presentation?
Yeah, we can start here. If there are no more questions, we can start transition to the next presentation. Our next presenter is here, I think.
Let me check.
Dieynaba, do I pronounce your name correctly?
Yeah.
You're here, right?
Well, yeah, I see them. All right, well, thank you again, Maros. I'll give Maros a round of virtual applause. Our next presenter is Dieynaba Niass from Sheikh Anta Diop University. I'm sorry for my pronunciation there. But Dieynaba Niass will be presenting on natural resource endowments and how they affect export diversification in Africa. So when you're ready, Dieynaba, the floor is yours. I'm not sure if maybe. Oh.
Good morning, everyone.
Oh.
Good morning, everyone. I want to share my screen, and I cannot share my screen.
I'm afraid I can't see your screen. I also hear a bit of an echo in your voice from your microphone. Not sure if there's anything that can be done about that.
Okay. Me now?
Yeah, you're a little quieter, but yeah, no echo. So I think that's much better.
Okay, I can share my screen. One minute.
Do you see in the bottom of Zoom window there is a arrow up? It says share screen. Can you try this button?
There we go. Okay. Yeah, we could see your screen now, Dieynaba. All right, we can see your screen, but if you're saying anything, we can't hear you right now. I don't because you're muted. I'm not sure if you are saying anything though.
You should unmute yourself, and maybe if you can go to the full screen mode.
Yeah, you reconnected, and we can see your screen again.
Sorry.
Oh yeah, we can hear you too now.
Okay, is it okay now?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, okay. Sorry. The plan of our presentation is the following parts. First, we're talking about research uses and objective, flowing by the methodology and data. After we show you the results, the different results, and we conclude with implication and recommendations. Let's talk about the research issue. Africa is relatively well endowed with natural resources, which occupy an important place in its economy. In it, minerals represent around 30% of the world's mineral reserve, with 8% and 7% for oil and natural gas, according to IDA 2017. Moreover, according to Kano et al., agriculture remains the main source of employment with about 57% of total labor force and mainly source of income for 90% of rural population. Furthermore, the African Development Bank and its report confirms that currently more than 45 countries in Africa have proven reserves of oil and gas and natural gas. Central Africa is a part of the continent which has natural resources. On average, 47% of its GDP come from their natural resources grants. The grants accounts 30% of regional GDP in North Africa. West Africa is the highest part of the continent that have a percentage of urban line, and East Africa is the most deprived part of the continent. This situation confirms the strong presence of natural resources in Africa. Thus, as the law of factor proportion suggests, commodities have very high weight in the supply portfolio of continent. For the African Development Bank report in 2016, minerals represent 70% of total volume of export and around 28% of Africa's GDP. Oil represents more than 50% of GDP. And for the African countries concerned, this natural resource endowment play an important role both the structure of domestic products and their profile of international trade. Even if these resources can provide the basis of structural transformation of the economy, which should lead them to appreciable levels of economic and social development, they can generate negative effect on the structure composition of sectoral productive activities, the international exchange of the countries, and slow down the process of economic emergence. The situation above leads us to say Africa's large natural endowment may suggest that they have negative impact on the possibility of diversifying. And we answer the following, we ask the following question: does the abundance of natural resources constitute a brake on the diversification of African economies? In the literature, several studies have developed that the abundance of natural resources is a source of diversification and then economic growth. However, according to GTAP and Asean, the abundance of natural resources seems to go hand in hand with poor diversification. The situation reflects the phenomenon of resource curse, according to Sachs and Warner, 1995, and OT. And the situation can be explained by different canals. We have institutional degradation with the quality of institutions, according to Turner and 1999, Leite and Weidman, Barbe and Alla, Diversion and Alla also. We have the canal of real exchange rate and explain the Dutch disease, and it's a phenomenon which brought out the industrial sector in developing countries and the agriculture sector in developing countries. The objective of our study is to analyze the effect of natural resources on the diversification of Africa's export supply portfolio. Specifically, to measure the extent of diversification or concentration of export in terms of product variety. And then we analyze the effect of natural resources on diversification of African export. And finally, we identify eventual canals through natural resources would affect the export diversification in Africa. Now let's talk about the methodology and data. In here, to make the extent of diversification, we use two indicators. First is count of active lines. It's the simplest and taking into account the extensive margin and according to Kado et al. 2011, we have also a diversification index, and in this study we use Herfindahl-Ishman index normalized. This index allows to appreciate the degree of diversification or concentration of countries. This index accumulates both the extensive and intensive margins of diversification. We have the formula here. Now, to analyze the potential impact of natural resources on diversification and the different canals, the simple panel model will be used in this study. And we have, we have the overall specification with UIT is a count index and HHINIT is a diversification index. The natural resource variables are measured as a percentage of export or percentage of GDP. This study covers the period 2000-2015 with 4 times period, 4 times points. That means making observations every 5 years. In panel dimension, it's necessary to determine the effect, and the effect can be fixed or random. Here we have the sources and definition of our variables. We have trade by product, comes from trade. We have GDP per capita, comes from the World Development Indicator, World Bank. We have manufacturing added value, and came from also with in the World Development Indicator. We use also lead time to export, and we have this variable comes from to Logistic Performance Index in World Bank. The Corruption Perception Index provides us the information of on the role that institutions can play in the processes of country diversification. It came from Transparency International. Real exchange rate came from Endowment, and also oil and natural gas came from Energy Information Administration, and we have the production of this the total production of these resources. We have also the oil and gas prices allow us to calculate total production in terms of money, and we have it's come from BP's statistical review of world energy. And finally, we have agriculture production. Comes from FEO stat. This graphics shows the description of our data with share of resources, both in percentage of export and GDP. We remark that oil is most important in Angola in terms of export and GDP. Respectively more than 90% and more than 80%. Nigeria is the first oil producer and exporter of the continent, and we show oil represents more than 80% in export and more than 30% in GDP. Here we have the results of the overall results of this study, and we have the different type of resources in terms of export and in terms of the national production. And we see that only agriculture export and oil export act on the diversification, and they act negatively on the count index. That means they reduce the number of export products. The results relative to export show that oil acts on the diversification negatively, and we show from the index of diversification, oil favors the concentration. In agriculture, these results show agriculture act negatively on the export product. From the point of view of the results relative to GDP, the resource variables have not affected the diversification of Africa. This negative effect can be passed by many canals, and to explain this relation, we estimate the different canals on the resource. We estimate the different variables of resources on the different canals, and we find that the negative effect of oil pass through the canals of institution degradation, and for the agriculture, it can be explained by real exchange rate. These results imply that from the point of view export, the presence of natural of oil and agriculture resources act negatively on diversification, and from the point of view of economic activity, the presence of natural resources does not act on diversification. The canals. The results shows that canals capture the negative effect of natural resources, oil and agriculture, if they are analyzed from an export perspective. The negative effect of oil goes from only the canal of degradation of institutions, and that of agriculture for the exchange rate canals. For the recommendation, to avoid the dependence of natural resources, African countries must strengthen their level of institution by fighting corruption, and they must orient also their agriculture sector to processing, because agriculture is have an important place in the country. Thank you for your attention.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dieynaba. Now let's go ahead and take some questions from the audience again. As a reminder, the preference is to enter your questions in chat, but you can also raise your virtual hand to be called upon. But I guess I'm going to take the chair's prerogative and ask Dieynaba the first question. So your results kind of like seem to say to me that having natural resources reduces the diversity of your exports, but really not the diversity of your GDP. And maybe the GDP.
Sorry, sir, I don't hear you.
I'm sorry?
Yeah. I use my. I'm sorry.
Oh, was there?
I use my kit. I use my kit. What to tell you?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure what you're saying, Dieynaba.
Okay. You can ask your question.
Oh, okay. So I guess if I understand your presentation correctly, that having these types of natural resource endowments reduces the diversity of your exports, but not the diversity of your GDP. And maybe I think we're often worried about Dutch disease or lack of diversity because of having some, I don't know, negative impacts on like economic development. And so maybe I guess your results say to me that this lack of diversity really isn't as big of a problem as you might otherwise think it is. I don't know if you agree with that or disagree, or kind of like what your thoughts are about the implications for the importance of diversity in your results. I'm sorry, Dieynaba, if you said something, I don't think I could hear it.
But can you speak slow, please?
Oh, sure. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Do you think diversity in the economy is important? I had originally thought it was pretty important, but your results made me reconsider it, since it seems that your results show that natural resource endowments don't really reduce the diversity of GDP. So I guess I was just asking you to just say anything you thought was important about the diversity of an economy and whether you thought that was important or not.
If I understand you, you ask me if the endowment of natural resources is important for diversity for export.
You could. I was just asking an open-ended question, so you can talk about that result if you want.
Is it the question if natural resources is important for export or for diversification?
So my question is, do you think diversification is important in general?
Yeah, of course, it's important. Like the developing countries like Africa, because Africa export only basic products, and when Africa diversifies their economy, they can export more products, and they can lead their development.
Okay. Okay. Good. All right. I guess one other question I might have is, what do you think the next research question you want to answer is, Dieynaba?
Natural resources, you say. You say natural resources.
No. What
Do you have? Mhm.
what question do you want to research next?
After this article, or the question of my article?
Okay. Let me try and put it in chat. Let's see if that might be better. So I guess my question is, for your next article, what question would you like to ask in that article?
I don't hear you.
So I tried putting maybe my question in chat. Maybe that would be easier.
Sorry, I want to ask for my flowing research to ask the problem of institutions like the country in Central Africa.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's an interesting follow-up question, especially given your results on oil and how it's the institution channel that affects things. So I think that makes sense. Are there any other questions? Okay. Well, I guess with that, thank you again, Dieynaba. Let's all give Dieynaba a round of applause.
Thank you, and I'm very sorry.
Yeah. Our next presenter is going to be Taojun Ji, a researcher at the National University of Singapore, who will be presenting on the impact of digital economy agreements on ASEAN development using a CGE model. So Taojun, the floor is yours when you are ready.
All right, thank you very much, Andrea. Okay, let me just share my screen. Okay, one moment, please. Okay, is it okay? Is it correct screen without the speaker slides?
Yeah, no, we can't see your secrets. It's just the slides.
Yeah, okay, that's great. Now it always happen when share the wrong screen. All right, okay, thank you very much, Andrea and the organizers for having our paper in this session. So I'm from the National University of Singapore, And this is joint work with Jingzhi and Manheng, who are my colleagues also in NUS. And so this is about the impact of digital economy agreements, which we call it DEA for short, and on ASEAN's development, which is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And we do this with something to learn from Singapore's existing DEAs, right? Okay, so what is a DEA and what is it for? So we get a quote from the Ministry of Trade and Industry in Singapore. And DEA is a treaty that establishes digital trade rules and digital economy collaborations between two or more economies. And through these DEAs with key partners, Singapore actually hopes to develop international frameworks to foster interoperability of standards and systems and support businesses engaging in digital trade and electronic commerce. So this is some kind of bilateral trade agreement, a bilateral agreement between Singapore and currently it's Australia and New Zealand. So there are also other types of digital economy partnership, for example, DEPA, the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, which is between Singapore, Chile, and a few other countries. So that was one of a kind of a multilateral agreement that establishes new approaches and collaborations in digital trade issues and also to promote interoperability between different regimes and addresses the new issues brought about by all the digitalization. Okay, so in this paper, in this study, we are asking this question: what are the various economic impacts of a digital economy agreement on the ASEAN region? So the reason for this is that Singapore has so far established these DEAs with Australia and New Zealand, but these are not the countries within the region. But Singapore, being the most developed countries in these Southeast Asian countries, it serves as a gateway for all the exports and re-exports from the region to the world and also from the rest of the world to this region. So we are thinking if we establish or if we hypothetically assume that there are certain kind of digital economy agreement between Singapore and its neighboring countries, and there will be some economic impacts, and this is the purpose of our paper. So what we do is we look at the terms or look at the modules in the DEA, and we interpret the DEA's modules as relevant shorts for the GTAP model and analyze the impact of sectorial outputs and also trade impacts, and also very different kind of trade impacts here for different countries. And our findings are that, so according to different modules, for example, there's a module for artificial intelligence, and there will be a large impact on the downstream industry arising from the inter-industry linkages. And if you look at the module regarding e-invoicing or paperless trade or fintech and e-payments, so this will increase regional trade volume among the signatories. So because it actually make all the trade trade paperwork easier, and also the payment will be faster and the settlement methods will be easier. So the last module is about the data flows. So cross data flows, we find that there needs to be a right balance of data localization policy, because some countries will be very protective about its own people's privacy and also its own company's data, while some other countries may be more open to cross-border data flows. So we need to find a right balance between this data localization policy, and so as to achieve the purpose of this digital economy agreement. Okay, so the motivation behind the DEA is as follows. So firstly, AI is actually well known to be revolutionary and also disruptive to the economy and also society. But it's also a strategic priority to actually maximize the gain of AI while minimizing the potential economic harms through the DEA, because when the productivity is increased, there may be loss of jobs and also different kind of economic consequences. So sometimes we do not want the efficiency to improve so fast that people cannot have a transition period, right? And also the large-scale free trade agreements to facilitate cross-border e-commerce has seldom been succeeded. For example, in ASEAN, there have been different plans to establish mutual trade agreements or or different kind of economic agreements. But to succeed in this, sometimes there are some obstacles there. So we are talking about the bilateral agreements between Singapore and its neighboring countries, so that we can make the job easier. So, for example, like what Maros was presenting, the multilateral negotiation is sometimes tougher than bilateral negotiations, right? And also, in terms of data, there has been tension between businesses and users regarding data collection. Data actually has become increasingly important factor of production, and it plays an integral role in all the digital trade. So if there's a liberal collection and usage of data, it can be beneficial for the firms, but it can also violate the privacy regulations. So therefore, there needs to be some regulations there, and to strike a balance between the ease of data flow and at the same time the growth of firms, and in terms of a firm's productivity and also other cybersecurity issues. Okay, so if you look at the existing trade pattern within the ASEAN region, we can see that the trade volume, which is the blue color bars, they've been rather constant, or we call it a stagnating. It's rather constant with a slight upward trend here, but the total share of intra-ASEAN trade has been declining slowly. I mean, yeah. So from the 25% in 2010 to about 22% in 2019. So intra-ASEAN trade has been declining slowly. Well, so that shows the importance of actually boosting the intra-ASEAN collaborations in terms of trade agreements. And there are also some obstacles there, which I'll explain later. But in this digital era, the technology actually presents an opportunity for for this deeper economic integration. And ASEAN countries are also resource constrained. And if, let's say, technology can help the firms within the country to grow, then why not? I mean, we should just leverage on the technology and try to overcome the bottlenecks in economic growth. So the Office of the US Trade Representative has identified several barriers that impede digital trade. And so these will include like technology barriers related to e-payments and authentication, and also data localization barriers. And we interpret, and this actually appears in the modules in DEAs, the Digital Economy Agreements. So in our paper, we actually interpret these barriers as in, we interpret the modules as changes to this barrier. So we give a shot to the model according to specific barriers in the digital trade to see how the economy will perform in when all this DEA has been imposed. So the current DEA is signed by Singapore is actually broad and ambiguous, and so they have been aimed to reap the gains of AI and to improve interoperability of data and to balance the production of security issues and business freedom by laying out the terms of fair business data collection. So these are some of the ambitious scale goals that DEA is been trying to do. And in our estimation, we use a standard GTAP model with Australia, New Zealand, because these are the existing DEA partners, and also Singapore and its neighboring ASEAN countries, excluding Myanmar because data is lacking for Myanmar. And also all other countries will aggregate them as the rest of the world. We have several key sectors that we want to focus on, which are DEA targeted. So for example, we have the ICT sectors. Also, there will be financial and services sectors because they take care of payments and also settlements, trade settlements, and also business services sector, which also facilitates trade flows between countries. So these are the three sectors that we especially pay attention to when we try to do our analysis. Right, as I said, Singapore's existing DEAs are with Australia and also New Zealand. So we'll use this as a benchmark for studying the potential ASEAN-wide DEA. So basically, we simulate some results for Australia and New Zealand, and then we do some counterfactual simulations for the ASEAN DEAs to see what would be the benefits for the ASEAN economies or ASEAN countries. So modules in here, as I mentioned, there are 3 modules that we pay attention to. One is the artificial intelligence, basically improving the ICT sector's productivity, and also the in-invoicing and fintech and e-payments. So these are for the financial services, and cross-border data flows is also some kind of impact on these sectors. Okay, so first we'll try to overcome the technology barriers through the AI module. DEA is actually a commitment to remove technology barriers through either collaboration, speeding up development by sharing resources, data, and infrastructure. So in this case, we model this shock. We don't model the removal of technology barriers as a shock to the downstream productivity for those sectors that are closer to the consumer market. And there will be a decreased cost and increased subsidies for the ICT sector development. And also there's an increased productivity for the ICT sector inputs. So we simulate all these shocks simultaneously for Australia, New Zealand, and Singapore to see how these countries actually perform in their respective sectors. So we can see that once the shock comes in, once the technological barrier is removed, then there's a significant increase in the output of the ICT sector particularly, because that's particularly targeted at the ICT sector. We have the AI improvements. And at the same time, the financial services and also business services sector also have productivity gains. So this is the low bound and upper bound and the average gains in the sectors, right? So all the 3 sectors that we examine experience a positive gain in after the DEA has been implemented. And then we apply this to the ASEAN region. So these are the short forms: Brunei, Indonesia, Cambodia, Laos, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand, and Vietnam, right? So these countries also experience output gain after we simulate a DEA within the ASEAN region. So the most gain will go to Singapore with about 10% gain in the outputs. But for the other countries, they also have at least a 2% gain in terms of output in the digital economy. So digital economy are the sectors that's related to ICT and also e-payments, digital services, and so on, right? So there's been an overall increase for the ASEAN digital economies. And the second barrier will be the fintech barrier. So DEA also commits to remove the barriers related to e-payments and also authentication. So through taking measured steps to harmonize digital trade systems and ensure smooth commercial transactions. So in this case, we treat it as a reduced trade cost in the countries in cross-border trade. And parties also recognize the need to increase the efficiency, accuracy, and reliability of commercial transactions. And so this one, we are modeling in a way that it's actually cheaper to move goods between countries due to a more effective interoperable trade systems. And so this is a cost shock to the economy, the lower cost shock to the economy. So what will happen to the output of the exports of the firms? Because the trade cost has been reduced, so we observe that the exports, this is the increase in international trade from Singapore's DEAs in force. So percentage change in the quantity of trade to the other countries will generally increase. So Australia and New Zealand will have an increase in trade to Singapore by about 6%, whereas Singapore's exports to Australia and New Zealand will increase by about 5 to 6%. So there's been a significant increase in Singapore's trade volume to the 2 regions due to the reduced cost in transaction and also the improvement in the e-payment and fintech system. And for the domestic demand, there has been an increase in demand for imports, whereas the demand for the domestic products has not been affected much. So we can see that there's for New Zealand, there's an increase about 2% of the imported demand for imports, And for the domestic goods, these are the very small numbers, 0.02% and 0.1% decline. So the domestic trade has not been much affected due to the reduction in the cross-border trade cost. So then if you look at the ASEAN-wide interaction, so these are the source countries and destination countries of exports. We can see that for Singapore's exports, its gain is the largest, about 71% if I take all the values and then calculate the gain in their exports. And for countries like Cambodia and Laos, Cambodia is KHM and Laos is LAO, the gain is slightly smaller, but anyway, all the countries experience a positive gain in terms of exports due to an improved e-payments in the digital economy agreement. Okay, so lastly is the more interesting issue on the data localization barriers, because data flow has been one of the key things in a lot of trade agreements nowadays. So DEA has committed to remove data localization barriers. Data localization basically means that when a firm sets up a branch in a foreign country, then whether or not the data has to follow the foreign country's rule so as to make the branch actually operable in that country. So DEA has tried to is committed to remove the data localization barriers through formulating policies based on existing international guidelines and allowing free choices in locating data centers and also computing facilities. And we model this as an increasing cost in ICT sector. Why? Because it's actually a one-off cost to the firms when they set up a branch in an overseas place. It has to impose some cost in order to align with the local government's data regulation. So there is a cost to them, but the cost can be different according to the different data transfer models. So if you look at Singapore and Australia's DEA, it explicitly sets out clauses to allow parties to use or to locate computing facilities or data center locations freely, which does not impose unnecessary costs to the firms. But for other countries, it may be different. So if you look at different models of data localization, there could be like limited transfer, whereby broad requirements to use onshore data storage is there. So the regulatory cost will be higher because there will be a lot of regulations when firms want to enter a market, for example, in China, or also for health data in Australia and also in UK. So for this kind of limited transfer, the cost will be high when the firms trying to set up their branch overseas. And somewhere in between will be the conditional offer, conditional transfer, where private approval is required for data transfers, and we can have GDPR and some similar plans as an example. And the most free data localization rule will be the open transfer. So there's no priori mandatory requirements. So there's a business freedom here. For example, we have an APAC privacy framework. So these three types of data models actually imposes different degree of cost when firms wants to penetrate an overseas market. And if we try to simulate the 3 degrees of cost to the firms or to the ICT sectors when it tries to penetrate the market, we can see that there have been some loss in the limited transfer model because the companies has to spend a lot of money trying to establish a new data center or to comply with the different data regulations in that country. And if let's say the DEA sets a conditional offer or an open offer, there's not much difference in between them, then we can see that the gain in terms of ICT sectors are roughly similar across these two models. And if you expand the whole thing to the ASEAN region, we will see that similarly, the limited transfer offer also gives the least benefits or the largest cost, whereas conditional offer seems to be better as compared to the open transfer model, right? Okay, so policy implications. Policymakers should actually look at developing the downstream industries such as business services, financial and insurance sectors. And these related downstream industries that increasingly rely on the ICT industry will create more value added, which has far-reaching implications on the economy. And the second implications will be to improve the interoperability and harmonization. So e-commerce needs to be supported by free data flow and strong linkages between partners in the network. And improving interoperability and harmonization of such systems regionally will be increasingly important and the key driver to increase digital trade volume between all the partners. And lastly, policymakers have to design an optimal data transfer policy to actually balance the key issues of business freedom and to maximize the digital economy's potential. The guiding principle regarding trade data flow should be liberal and open for non-personal data while keeping sufficient information security measures in place. So yeah, that will be all from me, and I look forward to your comments.
All right, thank you so much, Taojun.
Right.
All right, so again, we're opening it up for comments. As a reminder, please enter all questions in the chat and raise your virtual hand to be called upon if you would prefer to ask your questions in another manner. I guess I'd like to start off with a question, maybe a basic one that I should know the answer to, but I guess my experience when looking at like data localization requirements of other trade agreements is that a lot of times, so I'm familiar with the USMCA agreement that had anti-data localization provisions. But as I recall at the time, there were not any data localization laws in effect in the countries in question. So it was kind of like a prevention of like future possible data localization requirements. But it looked like you found that these like anti-data localization provisions had impacts in your model. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, if it's just more common in the ASEAN countries, or I don't know, what do you think about that issue?
Yeah, that's very good question. Okay, so in terms of modeling, we are doing a very simple way. I mean, sort of straightforward way, just reducing the ICT sector's cost in the cross-border trade. So, but you're right. I mean, ASEAN regions, most of the countries still do not have a very established data protection rule. So there's basically very few things that that people should take note of when they try to do the cross-border trade. But who knows? I mean, in the future, I mean, everyone will care about the data issues, and countries. I mean, from a political point of view, they do not want other countries to just come and violate own people's data privacy, right? So that's my understanding. But so sooner or later, there's going to be something there, and so if it's there, maybe when DEA is established earlier, it can do a preventive measure to just skip all the protocols and facilitate the cross-border data flow. I mean, that's that's possible. Yeah.
No, I think that's right from the perspective of the trade agreement. I guess one follow-up question for the I guess for the numbers you presented, how should I think of it? Should I think of it as kind of like these are like the current impacts of like the currently exit measures and it's like pretty small, or these are the impacts that you think future like actually substantial data localization requirements would have? So I don't know, how do you think I should think of that?
That's also a very good question, and we haven't thought about it. But then my first response would be, it is about the future benefits or costs, because as I said, there will be some data regulations there. I mean, it's just a matter of time. And when they are there, so companies and countries ought to spend some money or so experience some increased costs in dealing with the data localization issues, and that will be the impact on the economy. I mean, that will be an impact on the cross-border trade. Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Yeah, Maria.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I had a question. Maybe you said that. Sorry if I didn't understand it. When you draw the downstream industries, you lower the costs for them or increase their productivity. I don't know exactly how it was, but how do you measure the size of that impact? Do you have a reference for that, or is this?
Oh yeah.
Understandable?
Okay, so so that's also our challenge here. I mean, we still haven't found a way to actually justify the size of the shocks, especially when we try to shock everything together, because we want to try to capture as many digital economy elements as possible. But we also, I mean, it's actually our next step to try to calibrate the size of the shocks in each sectors, and also according to either empirical data or some estimation, right? So that's a very good question, and we are dealing with it. So.
And another question, if I may, the ICT sectors, which ones do you consider to be in that group?
So the ICT sectors would be those hardware and also the software firms. So both, either when they are trying to develop the trade software, trying to facilitate trade settlements, and also there are some hardware companies. So both hardware and software sectors are included. Yes. Yeah. And also the telecom companies. Yeah. Okay. Right.
Very interesting topic, and thank you very much for the very important presentation. The topic is very important. Thank you.
Thank you for your kind words. Yeah.
Do you have any suggestions, I guess, because I know, building off of what Maria said, I feel like this is a type of thing that's going to crop up a lot in future trade agreements, and other modelers, I think, may have to replicate your work or follow your footsteps when their national governments ask them, hey, we spent all this effort negotiating these digital trade provisions, but you haven't quantified them at all. Go and quantify them. So do you have any, I guess, maybe specific tips and suggestions for them? Or is it just all right, wait for us to finish our paper and then cite us and do what we say?
No, I'm actually looking for contribution, looking for suggestions in this also, because when we're trying to do this, it's actually we're just blindly searching for things that's related to digital economy. So especially when we say, okay, we want to boost the AI. So what's the contribution of AI in this productivity sector, and we want to improve the e-payment system. What is the reduction in cost in this? So I mean, these are actually very interesting empirical questions, and maybe we start with some empirical estimations first, and then we plug numbers into the model and try to quantify the effect. So we are still working on it. So this is a very preliminary version. Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks. I mean, it's really relevant question, and we should carefully think about it.
I agree. Thank you, Taojun.
Okay, thank you very much.
All right. Any other questions? I don't see any hands raised or any questions in chat. Okay. All right. Thank you again, Taojun. Let's all give a round of applause, virtual applause.
Thank you.
So our next presenter is Ingo Borchert, an economist at the University of Sussex, who will be presenting on services trade policy and services trade costs, new evidence for African economies. Ingo, when you are ready, the floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much, Andre. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thanks everyone for joining for your time. I see a couple of familiar names. So I'm Ingo, and this is joint work with colleagues from the WTO, Jocelyn Madeline and Juan Marchetti. Let me share my screen. So, Andre, can you just confirm whether you see my screen?
Yeah. We can hear you just fine. Your presentation looks good. It's in the correct mode, so we can't see your notes and everything looks good.
Super. Thanks very much, Andre. So as I was saying, this is joint work with two colleagues from the WTO. And the key point really on services trade policies and services trade costs in Africa is to introduce and demonstrate the novel kind of data on services trade policies that's been available, is going to be available very soon for Africa, a region that's been notoriously underserved in terms of data, and on which the data situation is very poor and very sparse. The data set on which this presentation is being based is a big multi-year project that involves both the World Bank and the WTO, and therefore here's the institutional disclaimer. I deliver this presentation entirely in my personal capacity, and all the interpretations and especially the errors and the conclusions are those of the authors or mine. Nothing I should say here about trade costs or where the gains from trade might be should be attributed to the World Bank or the WTO Secretariat or the member organization. So the usual thing, this is just a project that arose in close collaboration with international organizations. What's the background? We are in the sub-theme of the GTAP conference on tackling regional integration and regulatory cooperation. And this is exactly the kind of area where you need these kind of data for, especially when it comes to services trade negotiations. You would need these kind of information, qualitative information on applied services trade policies for identifying best regulatory practice, for facilitating negotiations, if anything, just for transparency, internal and external transparency. And that's what the services trade policy database is supporting. It's got a long history. It started with a World Bank database that started collecting information on these kind of applied services trade policies, and it very soon evolved into a joint collaboration with the WTO. And the data I've been presenting today is part of the WTO's ITIP services portal, which is a comprehensive portal that also puts information to the public on GATS commitments, on applied services agreements, on services trade flows, and amongst other things on applied MFN services trade policies. Now, the big point here really is, and the novelty is that recently, as part of this big database, we started covering African Union economies more comprehensively. Individual economies had been part of the database for a long time, but really only sporadically. And so over this 2-year effort, we are hoping to cover almost all of African Union economies, that we've got for the first time ever really a comprehensive picture of services trade policies across African economies. Now that sounds like a major effort, and it is a major effort, and it is really only being made possible by very generous support from various institutions, amongst which are various departments in the World Bank, in the WTO. Data collection has been supported in a major way by the German development agency Gesellschaft für internationale Zusammenarbeit, GIC, and also by the European Commission. The International Trade Center in Geneva was involved, and lots of colleagues and staff, both at the bank in Washington and at the WTO Secretariat in Geneva. So that financial support and in-kind support was absolutely crucial to that big database, which is a global public good being feasible in the very first place. I would like to give you, in that short presentation, a quick update on that African Union, on the data across African Union. I would like to give you a little bit of technical background on the services trade restrictiveness index that we could use for quantitative work then, because obviously the GTAP community is a community of modelers, and I guess you would want to understand a bit of the index construction that's going on in the back end. I'm going to show a couple of pictures that emerges, policy pictures across Africa, and then I'm going to present an illustrative application really about what we can say about how we can apply these data to make some inference about trade costs and trade cost changes of counterfactual policy scenarios. And I'm choosing ad valorem, an exercise in ad valorem equivalence, because I understand this is a crucial input in CGE modeling, and so a lot of people in the GTAP community might be interested in this. But again, the key point is that for the purposes of this presentation, the policy patterns and the AVEs, it's going to be covering 27 African economies, which is about half of what we are hoping to get to in the end, but it is already a first, right? Comprehensive and comparable, that's an important point, of course, for both policy work and quantitative work. Comparable information on these 27 African economies hasn't, to my knowledge, really been available before. We are covering 5 services sectors, which are broad sectors: professional services, telecoms, distributional services, finance, and transportation services, which break down into subsectors. So overall, we are actually covering, you've got regulatory policy information for 23 subsectors. These are just the broad notions. And by the end of the year, we are aiming at getting the data collection all the way up to 54 African economies, which is pretty much everybody except Eritrea. And we are also looking to enhancing the sectoral coverage to new sectors, but that's just to whet your appetite. The data for this is yet to come. So let me quickly go introduce you to the coverage. These are just the individual services subsectors at which level policies are really being applied. To give you the full picture, it's not just 5 sectors, it's really 23 sectors really. And those familiar with services trade know that services are being supplied or traded across various modes, and that's quite important, because the measures, what the database really captures in the very first place, are the applied policy measures, and these are very different across the different modes. So we are talking about local presence requirements in mode 1, we may talk about equity limitations in mode 3, we may talk about qualification requirements for service professionals in mode 4. This is a rich texture of the database that is provided in the first place, and that is very important in and of itself. It's only if you wanted to do quantitative work on it that you would then want to turn this qualitative information into a quantitative index. But these are really separate, and a good deal of the value of that publicly available database really comes from transparency in these applied measures. Let me talk a little bit about how we quantify that. This is exactly the second step I was just alluding to, which proceeds in 3 steps. And I'm just quickly going through this because not everybody might be familiar with these indices. So the first step, obviously, is that you need to look at your long list of measures, of key policy measures. You pick some of them which you deem most important, and you score them at the level. It can go, it can attract a very small score for a minor measure on transparency, and obviously something that only restricts foreign ownership in mode 3 to a minority foreign ownership would attract a much bigger restrictiveness score. And then at the level of individual subsector modes, we got these measured scores, and they need to be aggregated up to, because analyses typically proceed at a somewhat higher level. It's either the subsector level or the sector level, or perhaps even the economy level. And so we're going to aggregate this with a CES function, which is kind of a novel approach, and unlike everybody else does it, but it has a number of nice features that I'm going to spend a minute highlighting because that's really important. And lastly, we're going to make sure this kind of CES aggregation of scores is in principle unbound. And so we need to apply a bounding function to it just to make sure that the index is well behaved and stays within the unit interval. Let me give you a kind of example for that. We are considering here Andre, do you actually see my cursor here moving?
Yes, we can
Yeah,
see
we
this.
can.
Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you. So what we are doing here is we are considering the scoring, the policy restrictiveness of a medium range measure of that would score 0.5, and we would see what the overall and the incremental change in restrictiveness would be depending on the portfolio that's otherwise being applied. And so the first thing that might be quite obvious is that if there's just one measure of 0.5, the aggregate score is 0.5, but there are actually ways out there of constructing the index that would depend on the overall number of measures, which is not the case for CES aggregation. That's might be trivial, might sound trivial, but actually isn't. Now the second row is if there was already a 0.5 measure applied and you added a second one, then applying the CES aggregation formula would lead to an overall index of 0.63, which is smaller than the sum of the two. So we are not just adding this stuff up, but the index is actually decreasing. The restrictiveness index is decreasing, right? Because the second measure will probably overall add less to it, and that's denoted in that incremental change. And if you push this one step further, if there were already 2.5 measures in place and you would add a third one, then the incremental contribution to restrictiveness is even lower. So not only is overall restrictiveness decreasing, but the marginal contribution of restrictiveness is actually falling. And we think that's actually quite accurately capturing reality, because if you've got a bunch of 5 measures already applied, then the 6th measure doesn't usually make that much of a difference. This is quite different in its properties, in its mathematical properties, to other somewhat more simpler approaches. And then I don't want to go into the details of this, but this kind of picture will be very familiar to CGE modelers. It's just that we aggregate these scores up in a tree-like structure, very much like you would set up a CGE model. And that is the bounding function that simply says that the bounding function doesn't affect much of the scores, but if you suppose you aggregated up, you would totally up scores and scores and scores, you would get up to a range that would exceed the admissible maximum. And so we are ever so slightly bounding that function, the overall score in. And here you see the starting from a very high score of 0.75, you see how this is being worked out in practice with these scores for these African economies. They're ever so slightly bound inwards away from the 45 degree, and just to make sure that these restrictiveness scores never exceed unity as they shouldn't. Let me quickly go to a couple of, now suppose you have this index, right, and you buy into the quantification with all its technical steps. You can actually quantify, get a visual picture of applied services trade policies in Africa. These are radar charts of the 27 economies all the way from Angola to Zimbabwe for the 5 broad sectors that we are covering. And you see a couple of stylized facts. Professional services, that's the blue line in the right-hand side chart, tends to be more restrictive in most economies than financial services, with the exception of Mauritius, as it happens. And so, we might be interested in finding out why that is. Because modes of supply are something idiosyncratic to services trade. I wanted to show you that picture just to show that the index is also showing patterns across different modes of supply. Now, here I've picked for demonstration purposes financial services, where we see that policy restrictiveness in mode 1, these are these taller bars here, typically tends to be higher than restrictiveness in other modes, and that's just reflecting the preference of regulators to have foreign financial service providers on site for the purposes of regulatory oversight. And so cross-border trade is typically, countries and regulators are much less willing to tolerate cross-border trade in these types of financial services, going from life insurance to non-life insurance. I guess I still have maybe a couple of minutes left. So I would go on to the illustrative application now. So what can you do with this index, right? I mean, now don't forget that a major motivation for all of this exercise was to support the Continental African Free Trade FTA negotiations. Now that was one of the reasons why some of these donors, like the European Commission and the Gesellschaft für internationale Zusammenarbeit, the GIZ, were involved. You might want to run counterfactual policy reform scenarios, and our index is quite amenable to that. So we are doing this in a structural gravity framework, most people will be familiar, I guess, with the gravity framework. The one point I would like to make explicit is that we are doing this as good as should be. Standard good practice gravity estimation entails a wide range of fixed effects, and so you cannot typically identify the first order effect of MFN policies, and the STRI is an MFN policy in a gravity framework because it would be consumed by the fixed effects. And so what we are including in that gravity estimation really is an interaction effect of a border friction with the STRI. So what we are identifying econometrically here is the effect of MFN services trade policies on the size of the border effect. And so the ad valorem equivalent understood in this exercise is a percentage change in iceberg trade costs associated with a change in a non-tariff barrier, which is the STRI here. So it is always about a change in trade costs, right? This is very important. A lot of people have asked me in the past about, can you quantify the level of trade costs? And the answer is no, we can't. This is all about counterfactual scenarios of what policies, what would happen to trade costs if certain policies were lifted or liberalized. The one example, this is the formula that comes out straight out of a structural gravity framework. What we are estimating in the structural gravity model is this gamma parameter. It's the only one that we need alongside an assumption on the elasticity of substitution, and then we can run AVE counterfactuals for changes from some STRI value to a potentially lower liberalized level of services trade restrictiveness. The example I have been doing here, or we have been doing as a team, is to evaluate liberalization along a number of mode 4 policies, because I think that is, it is potentially being negotiated in the African continental FTA framework, and that's why we thought that kind of experiment might be useful in that context. I'm not going to bother you with the data details, but I would like to, as a caveat, say that unfortunately, real trade data, balance of payments, bilateral, sectoral, disaggregated services trade data is not available at all, other than I think South Africa, for all of these 27 African Union economies for which we've got the policy information, where we don't get the trade flow information. So we have been constructing a custom-made data set based on the WTO's balanced trade in services, the BARTIS trade in services data set, in order to be able to conduct this estimation. Now, the BARTIS data set is a constructed data set, and we need to keep this in mind. This is the first order, or the first stage, really. Gravity estimation, just focus on professional services. For the moment, it's got a plain vanilla standard gravity estimation with all the intuitive coefficients. What I've circled in red here is the border effect. The border effect is, of course, massive. It's massive in any kind of trade estimation, but it's especially large in services trade estimations typically. And so what you see here, this minus 0.5 is a big PPML coefficient, means that as it's negative, it means that as the STRI values are higher, as countries are more restrictive, trade flows are substantially less. So more restrictive policies increase the border friction. That's what it is. And on the basis of these estimated coefficients, we are running a hypothetical scenario. On the left-hand side, you just see a visual picture of how the
2 minutes, Ingo.
Yes.
2 minutes.
2 minutes? Fine. Thank you very much. You just see how the scores would change, right? So the 45-degree line would say that the policies, the counterfactual policy experiment here, which would consider, I should say this in the first place, I guess, typical mode 4 policies like quotas of people that can come into the country, economic needs test, labor markets test, nationality and residency requirements for foreign service professionals, or the absence of recognizing their qualifications, all of these are counterfactually dismantled as if it didn't exist. And then the STRI scores would fall. For instance, in Côte d'Ivoire, which is where my cursor is, it would fall from like 80 before to 45 afterwards. And so, you see there's quite a number of variations, and that depends not only on whether or not these policies, these quotas and economic needs tests and so on were applied in the first place, but also, and that's the beauty of the CES aggregation, on the portfolio of other measures that were or were not applied. And so we are estimating these gravity coefficients, and then you see the trade costs. The trade costs fall in ad valorem terms. It is the gains from services trade liberalization here on the right-hand side. And you see a lot of variation. So that's one thing that you see. And the other thing that you see if you look at the axes, that if you take these figures semi-seriously, these gains from trade can actually be quite large, potentially. So let me conclude, because I've probably only got 1 minute left now. We have to be a bit careful now. We did this gravity trade cost estimation, as best as we can with the data that we have, but the Bartis data set is a constructed trade flow data set, so we have to be a bit careful. There's also this issue about cross-modal effects of policy. So if you apply a mode 4 measure, like an economic needs test for foreign service professionals, it may have implications on foreign investment, which may or may not be forthcoming. So these cross-modal effects, which are nicely captured in the gravity estimation. And so let me conclude. The very first thing is that this services trade policy database that's published jointly by the bank and the WTO is a huge repository of policies, right? And that's of value in and of itself. And we will get very soon complete coverage of African Union economies. And we will also branch into new sectors such as health and tourism that are obviously quite important for some of these low-income African economies. If you are then willing to also, believe the conversion of these policy information into restrictiveness scores, you can do a range of quantitative work with it. And I showed you one AVE trade cost example that showed that these policy changes that are perhaps being deliberated currently in the African continental FTA could potentially be associated with quite substantial gains from services trade liberalization. Thank you very much for your attention.
All right, thank you so much, Ingo. Again, let's go ahead and take some questions from the audience. As a reminder, you can either enter your questions / comments in the chat or raise your virtual hand to be called upon. I guess, again, I'll take the chair's prerogative to start off by asking the first question myself. And would you mind going back, I think it was to slide 16. I guess this is a question I had about converting the STRIs to ad valorem equivalents. And so it does seem it's almost like I don't know, a 3-step process. So if I understand correctly, first you basically look at what the different services trade measures are, and you kind of just like have a dummy variable that says yes or no for all these different trade measures. And then you have this that flow chart you showed of like how this is aggregated up to get an overall STRI number. And because you want to bound it between 0 and 1, there's kind of like diminishing returns. So like an STRI of like 0.95 is like, in some sense, a lot more restrictive than one that's 0.9. It's more than just a 0.05 difference between the two, because they're already so high already. And so is that kind of like how I should think about maybe this function here is like undoing that bounding exercise? I guess my 2 questions there are, one, is that how I should think about this this exercise here? And then 2, instead of calculating from the AVEs from the STRI directly, if you have all those raw inputs into it, that maybe seems like maybe that would be a better method that doesn't require you to make the structural assumptions about like how those qualitative measures turn into STRIs in the first place. So yeah, I guess
these are all excellent questions. I think these are probably rather than like 5 questions, but they're all very, very good, Andre. And I apologize because, you know, obviously for want of time, I went in with an incredible speed over something that should be explained a lot more carefully. So let me try and, you know, take it step by step. So your first question was kind of paraphrasing of how we do the quantification. And I think basically you paraphrased it quite correctly, except for the very first thing, that it's not a dummy approach. The restrictiveness of individual measures is scored at the measure level, and that's not a dummy. So for instance, if there's a minor transparency issue that, you know, or a regulator is not independent in telecoms or this thing, it would, and again, these measure level scores are on that 0 to 1 scale, it would get a very low score like 0.25 or 0.125 even. And if something is really restrictive, like, you know, cross-border trade in services is not possible unless you establish commercial presence or unless you use a local intermediary. This is very restrictive for mode 1. So we would score it at a 0.75. That's the only clarification. But then these scores aggregate in a pyramid way all the way up, and you paraphrase this correctly. However, the point of this bounding function, and that's my second clarification here, really is only to make sure that the score never exceeds 1. And so we call it a 2-part bounding function because we leave 3/4 of the range of the score completely untouched, right? So it's not that we would be compressing the entire range of the score. It's just that when restrictiveness gets very, very high, we have a so slightly bounding it inwards. And you can see this here that for you know, there's in the case of the African Union sample, it's actually only 11% of the scores are being affected at all by the bounding function. So that means, you know, 89% of the scores are not affected by the bounding function, and it shouldn't be. So we are not distorting things really. We're just making sure that they stay within the unit interval. And then the last thing is you apply this bounding function and then you get at a score. Now, people are very interested in having these ad valorem trade cost changes, and that's the reason why we're doing it, and it involves a couple of assumptions, as you say quite correctly. That formula comes out of a structural gravity model, which allows you to specify a trade cost function, which is a variable trade cost function, and just, you know, consider the ad valorem as the trade costs, the taus ij, given a lower STRI scores as a percentage of the tau ij's with a potentially higher STRI score, and that is a structural expression for it. If you want it in ad valorem terms, I think this is what you have to do. What I completely agree with you with is if you want to do other kind of exercises, there's nothing that prevented you from sticking in even individual measures like an equity limitation directly into the gravity equation and see what that effect might be. And this is absolutely true. But, you know, our list of measures is like 700 plus. So, you know, this runs into a danger of running out of degrees of freedom, right? You can't do this comprehensively. And so you would, if you did this, there would always be a certain degree of arbitrariness to it. This is one reason why the score actually comes in handy, even though it misses some of the measure level action in the policies. This is of course true, but it safeguards against the arbitrariness and the kitchen sink approach, because you can't just stick all of these measures in it. Not only would it be way too many measures, but a lot of them are actually also collinear, right? Which is something that the novel CES aggregation actually also tries to alleviate, because you know, if you've already an array of 5 measures, the 6th doesn't matter anymore, and that's actually novel to this kind of aggregation approach. It's not the case if you just sum this stuff up subject to some sort of linear weighting. Sorry, that was a long answer, but you know, it was a series of actually very good questions, and thanks for the opportunity to clarify a couple of things.
I really appreciate that. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you for walking me through those different steps and explaining them. Again, appreciate that. If there are any other questions, you can raise your hand or post in chat. Otherwise, I'm going to ask another question. So this database with the, I think, Valorem equivalents is like really great. Is this already been released? Is this coming out soon? How could I download it?
Yeah. That is the obvious question I was trying to dodge, Doug. No, it is. We're sort of nearly there. It's not yet, but as I was saying, previous versions of the database are publicly available on the World Bank website and certainly on the WTO website. It is part of the WTO's ITIP Integrated Trade Intelligence Portal ITIP Services part, where the 2016-19 scores, that's the last big update that we did, the second vintage of that database, is freely available to researchers and the research community. These latest sets of scores that I was presenting today, which is 2020 African scores, are not yet published. We didn't want to do this sort of in sequence. As I was saying, we are currently having reached 27, but we want to go the whole hog to 54. And once we've got all of them, the data are being sort of processed as we speak. This will be made fully available because it is a public good and it is a public resource that will be fully accessible. Again, including the scores, if you are a CGE modeler, or the individual policy measures, if you are a negotiator. This is very important. I said this, but it's important to say it again. The needs of the users of that database might differ, and you might want to find out whether in air transportation services there is a certain equity limitations in Rwanda or what have you, right? And the database would allow you to look this up.
Yeah, I think that's great. I remember actually using these in the past to estimate the effects of, unfortunately, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement and U.S. accession to that. And having those scores for the individual measures was very helpful because then we could compare to the terms of the agreement and get exactly how the STRI would change under the agreement, which is very helpful for estimating the Valorem equivalent. So I think that's exactly those things are useful even for CGE modelers too.
Yeah. Oh, okay. I see. Okay, good. Glad to hear that.
Okay.
I think my co-authors, I mean, I don't want to dodge any other audience questions, but I think Jocelyn is my co-author is actually here. If you wanted to add any, oh, I see. I think we have a chat in here. There's a chat entry. Do you have an estimate for when the database with 54 countries will be available? I'm sort of on the data index constructing end of it. If my colleagues at the WTO Secretariat could take a stand on that, I'd be grateful. The time frame at the moment is, I think that we have these data ready by the end of 2022, by the end of this year. I mean, we're halfway into 2022. The idea would be to have it by the end of the year, but take this as an indicative schedule. If Jocelyn wants to qualify this further, I'd be grateful.
So first of all, thank you very much to my co-author, Ingo, for making such an efficient presentation and clear, and also for the organizers for having us in this GTAP conference program. Maybe so just to clarify on what Ingo was saying, the plan is to have this information available during the summer and publication by October.
Can I just ask a clarification then? So that's by October of this year, or are you talking now about next year?
October 2022.
Well, I mean, you'd be excused, and I take it in good humor. I've been around this business for more than 10 years, and we started collecting, major update of these. We started collecting this in 2016 with policies, and then we ended up publishing this 3 years later in 2019. So these projects are incredibly complicated, technically demanding, and it's a bit prone to delays. So you're quite justified in asking this kind of question, but I hear what Jocelyn is saying. And of
okay,
course,
no. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going, and of course, you want to get it right? I mean, there's always a huge amount, a truckload of data, but it needs to be vetted, it needs to be looked at, and that always takes much more time than we would like to anticipate. So that's one of the reasons. Please go ahead.
Absolutely. No, I certainly fully appreciate the time factor on this. Just a clarification too, then that includes the AVEs in the release by October, is that right?
Oh, that's a very good question. No, it wouldn't include the AVEs because the AVEs is something that we use the policy data and apply it to, right? It involves that, very much like Andre noted, a whole bunch of further assumptions, right? So you need to set up a gravity estimation in the first place that involves judgment choices on the data. Because this is Africa, we chose to do it with Barte's data, but you might feel not comfortable doing it, or you might want to use another data set, or you might want to estimate the coefficient that you need on a different data set for which there is actual sectoral bilateral services trade flow data in 2020. It's quite demanding. And then just extrapolate that coefficient to African economies. If that's what you feel more comfortable with, you could do. So the long and short of it is producing the AVEs involves a big number of assumptions, not only in estimation, but also in what the policy experiment should be, right? I've presented one policy experiment that we think makes a lot of sense, but there's a large number of potential policy experiments that you would want to run or could run, and we cannot, run all of this and then publish it. So what we do is, what will be public is the qualitative policy information, the quantitative STRI information at perhaps various levels, at the most disaggregated subsector modal level, and then aggregated further up, perhaps to the subsector level. And then you are free to do with it whatever you want, as long as you cite the paper and the database.
We should move to session closing, I think.
Okay, great, thank you. So that wraps up our final presentation and discussion period for the session on multilateral trade negotiations and trade and services. Please help me in thanking our presenters for their valuable time and thoughtful presentations. So Maros, Dieynaba, Taojun, Ingo, thank you all so much for presenting. We also appreciate everyone joining us and hope you enjoy the remainder of the conference. Please feel free to continue these conversations. I think they've been very productive and very helpful. And thank you all.